The Black Plague. Is there any way to stop it or even fight it? Today we're going to talk about how. To start with, there are a few buildings that actually spread the plague. The first one is roads. We can't demolish roads, so there's not much we can do about that, but other than avoid building them. The others are marketplaces. It shouldn't be surprising to know that marketplaces and trade in general help spread the plague. Another one is market villages. Again, a rather obvious one. But then we also have slave markets, trading hubs, the stock exchange, and entrepôts. These are the 6 buildings you kind of want to avoid building if you want to fight the plague. And more importantly, you may wish to demolish them when the plague actually happens. As I said, they increase the spread of the disease. So even if you find yourself doing your best to fight the disease by building hospitals everywhere, if you have a market in the same location, it kind of counteracts the effects, because a marketplace increases the spread by 20%, where a hospital kind of increases the disease resistance by 10%, leading to a situation where the marketplace actively counters the hospital. Speaking of hospitals, one of the things you probably want to do is just build hospitals everywhere you can. They can only be built in cities, but those are your most populated territories anyway, so it's usually a good idea to throw them down any way you can. Another thing you want to do in the lead up to the plague is not tax your burghers. You want their satisfaction to be at 75% when the plague happens, so that we can enact certain laws that will assist with the plague. One final thing you may want to do is close your borders. During the plague, pops will attempt to migrate away from territories that have the plague, and they will cross borders to enter your territory. So disallowing foreign migration can definitely help with that. Unfortunately, you cannot stop internal migration. So nobles and clerics will often migrate from infected provinces and locations to uninfected ones, and thus spread the plague. But if at the very least you can stop foreign pops entering your country, you can stop them coming in and spreading the plague. You don't need to do this immediately style game. I would recommend waiting for a parliament and using that to close the border if you intend to. Now we're actually going to flash forward to when the plague actually arrives, and then we'll talk about things we can do when the plague arrives. So the plague has now gotten close to our borders. The first thing we're going to do is isolate our country. This stops foreigners from importing and exporting goods to us. This helps because importing goods can bring the plague in, which shouldn't really be surprising. Trade, as we've established, lets the plague in. So we'll isolate our country, pretend for stability. The plague has now landed in our country. For our next action, we have to choose a disease control action. Of the 2 options, we have segregate the infected and expel the sick. Expel the sick may seem like the better option because it gives you access to the pest house, which provides 30% resistance to the plague. But the problem is, the pest house will only work at 50% efficiency due to one of the resources required, that being incense. If we zoom out, you can see there's no incense in Europe. It's only located here in Yemen, which we're not going to be able to get access to. So the pest house will be operating at 50% efficiency, meaning it will decrease disease resistance by 15%. We also have to build them, and they cost around 50 gold to build. So it's going to be quite expensive. Instead, we'll go for segregate the infected, which provides a disease resistance of 15% in every province and doesn't cost any money. Wow! Clearly a better option than expel the sick. So we'll go with that for 10 stability. For our final move, we have isolate cities. This means all urban locations will get the isolated city modifier, which reduces the impact of the bubonic plague while increasing control. How effective this policy is based on how much control you have in the location. So our capital will get the full at 80% decrease. This will cost 40 stability, but we're going to do it anyway. Now we've essentially done everything we can to resist the plague, we're going to wait and see what the casualties look like. The plague has now left our nation. We can see our overall casualties here of 206k. Now you might be asking, what do we do with this information? Well, I actually did a few tests before this run where I did nothing to prevent the plague, and my casualties were around 360k across those 3 attempts. So we've essentially saved 160k of our population. So the question becomes, was it worth it? Is saving the 100 or 1,000 or so pops worth it? That's something that's kind of going to be up to you. If your pops are, of course, very valuable, they're the ones that pay tax. And one thing you'll notice that after the Black Death, the tax income across Europe and the world shrinks massively because the amount of people have died and are no longer paying tax. So by preventing the deaths of some of our people, we've managed to stave off those negatives. If we actually look at some of the other neighbouring countries, for example, let's look at Naples. They've lost half of their country, more than half, of more than 1 million people, whereas we've lost around 200k. Countries like Byzantium have lost around half of their population, reducing them to around the same population as us almost. Whereas someone like Hungary lost, again, half their population at 2 million. But we didn't lose half our population, that's the thing. We lost something more like 20-30% of our population. So in a way, we're kind of ahead of a lot of our smaller neighbours who have lost far more pop than us, and are at the same level as a lot of our larger neighbours who've lost enough pop that we now match them. For example, Milan in the north of the country now has a similar pop number to us due to how many of them have died. Should Milan be the similar population to Sicily? Probably not. But as I said, it's about the cost. The building hospitals, if we added up the cost of that, would be around 1,000 gold. All of the stability costs were around 60 stability to combat the plague. If you're going to play as a tool nation, then saving any population you can is definitely important. But if you're planning to play a more wide nation, I think the effects of the plague don't matter as much because you're going to expand your population via conquering other countries. But let's say you wanted to take a very limited approach to the plague, but you wanted to reduce its effects as much as possible. I recommend just taking the segregate the infected action. It only costs 10 stability and provides 15 plague resistance everywhere. On top of that, if you want to preserve as much pop as you can within your cities, I recommend isolating the cities for 40 stability. Though do keep in mind you'll need your burghers' happiness to be at 75% to enact this. I also recommend sponsoring the forgiveness just as the plague's about to leave your country. It'll give you 12 stability at a little cost per month. You can see here it costs stability to revoke this action, but if you never revoke it, it will just vanish when the plague officially ends. So you'll essentially gain 12 stability for a ducat or so a month, as well as some buffs to the clergy, and then it will just go away on its own. So if you want to gain back some stability lost, I recommend doing this. For our other actions, we can just repeal them at no cost. And it's as if nothing happened. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you thought. Do you think it's worth closing down as much as your country as possible to preserve as much as your population, or would you prefer just the simpler actions like segregating the infection and not really worrying about building hospitals and letting the disease really just run its course? As I said, thank you again for watching and see you next time.